A Tall&Small Collection, Season 2, Chapter 44, and Everyone Needs a Little Hero, Chapter 31, True Colors Revealed, Part 4. It had to work. It was a long shot, but it had to work. There was little else they could do in the moment to deter the determined menace. Ashlyn's fingers typed furiously against the keyboard, researching anything and everything she could to get Austin in trouble. While Dorian and Ray were both doing the best they could, their knowledge of human laws and how to research was severely limited. After nearly an hour, Ashlyn was finally ready. "Well, here goes everything," she muttered as she pulled out her phone and began dialing. There were about a dozen calls she needed to make, and she didn't have a lot of time to do it. While Ashlyn worked in the other room, Casper and Soren had the practically impossible task of breaking the news to the borrower community. Though still shaky, Soren was able to stand upright and help Casper inform the populace. "What do you mean, leave? We have to leave? Move? What about our children? What supplies can we take? Are we safe here?" There were dozens of questions being shouted out from the crowd. It took Casper's repeated shouting for everyone to calm down. "I understand that you all are unsure about what to do next, but you need to listen. It is not safe to leave here, not on your own. There is still that dangerous chemical in the walls and main passages, and a human, Austin, is actively searching for us at the exit points," stated Casper. "Casper, he knows we're here. We heard him and the Ashlyn woman talking," called one of the young mothers as she held tight to her infant. "She's right. We didn't hear much, but nowhere is safe," called someone else who was hidden in the crowd. This earned a collective murmur of uncertainty through them. "And if nowhere is safe, where do we go?" called the others. Soren looked to Casper, weariness hanging on the middle-aged borrower's brow. Soren cleared his throat, wheezing slightly as he did, and stood as tall as he could on top of the cracker box they had moved to the center of Ashlyn's bedroom. "That's not true. We do have places to go," called Soren as he looked out into the concerned faces of the crowd. "Ashlyn just bought a new home. It is far away and in a neighborhood with other homes. My brothers and I went there, and we found tunnels and hooks that used to belong to borrowers." An ominous tensity filled the air. It was like everyone had already guessed where Soren was going with his words. Some squirmed nervously, while others looked instinctively toward the walls, obviously wondering whether or not they should make a break for the relative safety behind the wood and plaster. "It is obviously your choice, but Ashlyn can get us all there safely," stated Soren. His words were immediately met with backlash. "You say it so easily. Of course you'd suggest that. This is just another ploy for the humans. Pet!" It was hearing the word pet that made something in Soren snap. He clenched his fist and felt himself bristling. He felt Casper's arm rest on his shoulder, as if signaling that he was going to step in, but Soren stepped forward and looked determinedly into the crowd. "If you want to stay here, then be my guest," shouted Soren. "If you have a better alternative, please come up here and suggest it. I can tell you now that the lingering gas in the walls will get to you before you can make it to the ground floor. There is fear and uncertainty everywhere, and that's just the way it is. Being a borrower has never been easy, and accepting help or charity is not how we do things. But now is not the time to let our fear dictate what we do. Now is not the time to turn up our nose at help. You're trusting Ashlyn right now by staying here with her. What is the difference between staying here with her now and letting her take us to someplace safe?" The creak of the floor just outside Ashlyn's bedroom instantly hushed the disquieted crowd. Uncomfortable silence filled the room once more as everyone remained quiet, straining their ears and listening as Ashlyn was on the phone with someone over the phone in the other room. Casper stepped up once more and grasped Soren's shoulder, reassuring him instead of attempting to calm or dismiss him. Soren thought about continuing, but his lungs spasmed once again and his coughing fit returned. When he had caught his breath, Casper turned back to look at the crowd.
I know you all are afraid, but I want you to ask yourselves what is best for your family right here and now. Knowing everything you do now, are you willing to risk the safety of your families to chance, possibly getting caught or hurt by Austin?
Asked Casper.
Or are you willing to trust a human who's proved herself multiple times once more? She helped save my son, and she's helped Soren and his brothers as well as the whole community. I know my answer.
Casper's family looked up at him before looking back out at the crowd and nodding their approval. Hero, who had been helping distribute cotton balls for pillows and bedding, shivered with excitement. This meant he could stay with Ray and his other friends. This meant they were all going to stay together. As Hero held his breath and listened to the others around him, a few borrowers began asking questions. But they weren't accusatory or hesitant. They sounded, in a word, positive. How are we going to get out of here? Is the house far? What are we going to do for supplies? What is the house like? You said you saw other borrowers live there, right? Does that mean it's safe, or does that mean it used to be safe? While the conversation continued, and while Casper and Soren answered questions about what transportation would look like, Hero hurriedly finished helping out and headed for the main door. Slipping under was an easy trick, and finding Ray and Dorian on the coffee table in the living area was also very simple. He spotted Ashlyn pacing back and forth in the kitchen, and it was obvious she was in deep conversation with whoever was on the other end of the line. He quickly ascended the secure line that led from the floor to the edge, and hoisted himself onto the table just in time to catch part of Ashlyn's conversation. Yes, it is outside of my apartment complex. It says pest control and extermination. But I checked, and there's no business registered under that name that I can find, she said. It might be an independent company, but they're parked in the tow-away zone, and if I'm being honest, the guy who drives the car is a little suspicious. There was a pause as Ashlyn nodded, pulling the bottom of the phone away from her lips as she took a deep, calming breath. Hero wanted to know what was happening. What's going on? Hissed Hero. Ashlyn is talking to the non-emergency service people, whoever they are, said Ray. And she contacted a few other people, saying she smelled some weird gas, and she said it had something to do with Austin's car. I didn't understand much. It might not do much good, but it should give us enough time to get out of here safely. Hopefully, he'll be so preoccupied that he won't give us a second thought. She sounds convincing so far, agreed Dorian. I'm technically up next after she gets off of the line and needs someone else to call in. So jittery, I can't stand it. This is worse than performing. So she's trying to get him in trouble? Asked Hero, who was a little unsure about how these rules worked in human society. Basically, Ray said. If we can get him away from his car, it'll keep him away from his gear. At least, that's the hope. Ashlyn continued to pace as she provided the address of the apartment and a description of the car. When she was asked her name, she said she wanted to remain anonymous, and that she didn't want to get involved. Shortly after, she quickly ended the call and turned off her phone. Dorian, you're up next. If we don't see the car towed in the next hour, You'll just be another concerned citizen, okay? Asked Ashlyn. Dorian nodded nervously and bounced on his toes, shaking out his nerves as he took a few deep breaths, just like Ashlyn had done. Their human companion sat down on the couch and reached over, giving Dorian a reassuring pat on the back with the pat of her index finger.
I'm all right, Dorian said nervously. Let's just hope it all gets taken care of.
I'm sure it will, chimed in Hero.
You guys are prepared for everything. It's going to work.
Thanks, Hero, said Ray as he folded his arms across his chest. But there's still the whole issue about all of this alleged evidence he has. The sad thing is, we don't know if who was in his vehicle was everyone. For all we know, he has a house with walls of cages with borrowers in them. We'll worry about that next, said Ashlyn. Until then, Hero, any word on how everyone is feeling? Are you all right? Do you need anything?
Not now, but thank you,
said Hero.
Actually, I came to tell you that everyone seems to be on board with coming with you to the new house.
Transportation is obviously a concern, but it seems like they're willing to trust you on this. A warm smile spread across Ashlyn's lips, and a little bit of tension released from her chest. She wasn't sure how the borrowers were going to take her suggestion, but it seemed like they were at least willing to try. That was what mattered. So, in an effort to prepare and distract themselves, they started devising a plan to get everyone out with the least amount of suspicion possible. Enraged, furious. It had only been, 3, maybe 4 hours? How could she move so quickly? There was little doubt in his mind that it was her. Why did he think that she would simply retreat and hide? Why did he think she wouldn't take these measures? Was he really so eager to check the walls for any stragglers who had been left behind? How did he not see this coming? Evidently, she had got them to trust her quickly. That was his mistake. He was relying on their fear and apprehension of humans to try and escape once he talked to Ashlyn. Well, tonight she would be on the receiving end. Tonight she would have everything taken from her. Austin crumpled the papers in his hands and watched his vehicle, everything he had, vanish around the corner on the back of a tow truck. If they dared to look inside, no, he didn't need it. In fact, he didn't need any of it. All he needed was one. He made the mistake of bringing them all with him, thinking he would be making his delivery shortly after his gig. Well, all the proof he needed was right inside, and the only thing stopping him was a door. Patience. Tonight, he'd have what he needed before midnight. Then they'd see. They'd all see. Night settled over the residents of Ashlyn's home. Evening promised rest for the restless, and the next day promised to be eventful. Their plans were set. It was going to be the single greatest migration in all of borrower history, if borrowers had a written history, that was. Ashlyn was going out first thing in the morning to get as many flat totes as she possibly could. She was going to fit the top with lightweight belongings in case someone wanted to check all the borrowers below were safe and sound. Since she closed on the house and already had access to the keys and everything, getting the borrowers in wasn't going to be the issue. The only hazard, if any, was going to be getting everyone quietly to comply and to get into what was essentially a cage, albeit temporarily. Ashlyn didn't even want to think about what their perspective was going to be. It was like something out of a horror film. It was hard to imagine a giant taking her and her family from her home with limited to no supplies. It would be terrifying if she had no choice but to blindly trust that same giant with her and her family's safety, especially after having so much fear instilled in her. Even though she had been accommodating, it was still only a drop in the bucket for what trust truly needed to be built between her and the borrower community. So, as she laid on her couch all curled up under her snuggly blankets, she tried to push these thoughts and concerns from her head. She tossed and turned from one side to the other, unable to find comfort in the curves of the couch cushions. A quick glance toward the bedside table revealed Soren sleeping peacefully with Maisie curled up in his arms. Dorian and Ray had also decided to camp out with her in the main living area. Hero had gone back into Ashlyn's bedroom a few hours ago, and Ashlyn could only imagine she was not the only one kept awake by thoughts of what would happen as soon as the sun was up. It's nice they are able to get some rest, Ashlyn thought as she watched Soren's chest rise and fall. Envy struck her hard. She either needed to find a way to get some sleep or get something done. Anything was better than nothing. After another 30 minutes, Ashlyn decided she had had enough. Her thoughts wouldn't let her sleep. The quiet of her apartment was unnatural, and, if she was being honest, she had a lot of work to do before she managed to get all of the borrowers out of the building all at once. She had barely peeled off the blankets from her frame when she heard something coming from her front door. Ashlyn held her breath and listened harder. It sounded like a faint clicking of metal. Her heart dropped and her insides churned. It couldn't be, could it? Ashlyn barely had time to push herself up from the couch when she noticed the lock on her front door starting to tremble and turn. Every nerve in her body screamed to run and hide. A dozen things needed to happen all at once. But would she have time? In an instant, she reached over and shook Soren and his brothers.
What?
Soren barely had time to get the words out when Ashlyn held her fingers up to her lips. One look, and Soren knew the wild panic in Ashlyn's eyes.
Call the police and stay hidden,
Ashlyn mumbled as she hurriedly scooped up all of them and slipped them and her phone under the couch. She sprung up, hearing the shout of surprise from Ray and Soren's rapid explanation. Praying this wouldn't induce widespread panic, she opened her bedroom door, locked it, and slammed it back shut before hurrying back to the couch and throwing the blanket over her once more. She prayed her pretending to sleep would be enough to trick the intruder, and she already suspected who it was. The lock clicked open, and, after a few seconds, it creaked open. Ashlyn's body was on pins and needles, her heart beating wildly, feeling like it was pumping air more than blood. She wanted to vomit and hide, but there was little else she could do right now. Straining her ears, Ashlyn could barely make out Ray as he spoke on the phone with the police, speaking in hushed tones and relaying the essential information. The sound of footsteps tiptoeing into the apartment sounded like crashing thunder. Every moment lasted for eternity, but she had to stay still. She had to give the police a chance to get there. Ashlyn didn't need to open her eyes to know that she was being watched, evaluated to determine whether she was asleep. Hoping she could pull this off, she groaned and stretched before forcing her body to lay limp once more. It worked. Seemingly satisfied, the footsteps retreated down the hall part of the way and stopped at what Ashlyn assumed was her bedroom door. She heard the sound of metal clicking once again. The bedroom lock would not be half as complicated as her front door lock. The time for hiding was over. Without a plan and without a weapon, Ashlyn took a single breath and forced herself up quickly before she could change her mind. Sure enough, he was. Austin was crouched by her bedroom door with what looked like a lockpick set entwined in his fingers. His head whipped around as he noticed Ashlyn's sudden movement, and the two of them locked eyes. For what felt like an eternity, they stared at one another. Ashlyn felt herself trembling as she saw the devious gleam in Austin's eyes. A sly smile curled onto his face as he left his tools in the lock and stood slowly. I knew you had something to hide, he said softly. With a nod to the door, he asked, What's behind there, Ashlyn? Don't do this, Austin, implored Ashlyn, as she kept her eyes on the young adult. Don't do this? Oh, that's precious, scoffed Austin. Funny, you didn't let me set this in for my car. You didn't let me say that for my whole business model. My investors need results, and you didn't give them a say. You're over here about to reap all of the benefits by keeping these little pests under your thumb. But I don't get my cut because our methods happen to be different. Ashlyn's insides churned uneasily. She was suddenly hyper-aware that she had no weapons and no way to defend herself. Austin might be younger and a little smaller, but he was in his prime of physical fitness. Ashlyn was at a huge disadvantage, and it was so painfully obvious now that Austin even managed to pull himself out of his fixation to realize this for himself. She needed to say something to get his attention. Austin, they're not pets, and you know it, argued Ashlyn. Please, leave, and don't come back. You're already going to get in trouble. Don't get yourself into more trouble now. You're breaking and entering, and when the police find and report what's in your car, oh, they won't have a chance. I'll be long gone. And I'll be, how did you say, borrowing one of your little friends. Or a handful, if you don't mind. There's so little, you won't even know they're gone. And you, on the other hand, are the one who is in trouble, smirked Austin. Just stay out of my way, and you won't get caught up in this. Austin turned back to the door and started to slip his tools back into the lock. Time was up. Ashlyn needed to do something, and she needed to do it now. The first thought that came into her head was a foolish one, but it was all she could think of to do. With all of her might, Ashlyn ran forward and wrapped her arm around Austin's neck and threw her weight backward. She was hoping to simply choke him out like how they did in the movies. She had taken a few self-defense classes, and she started with a good hold. Sadly, Austin seemed to have braced himself for the attack. He was ready for it. As soon as Ashlyn's arm wrapped around his neck, he abandoned his tools and grasped her wrist, wrenching it partially away from his neck and giving him the air he needed, as Ashlyn threw them both back onto the ground. She tried locking her legs around his torso, but the young adult man was lean and able to twist around to face her. You shouldn't have done that, he snarled with a sadistic gleam in his eyes. Ashlyn gasped and tried to shout, but Austin began pressing his forearm against her throat. She thrashed and kicked, but his weight on top of her was just enough to keep her partially pinned. With what strength she was quickly losing, Ashlyn wrenched her hand around and scratched along Austin's neck and cheek, creating deep gouges. He suppressed a yelp of pain as he yanked his head back, letting up on Ashlyn's neck. She coughed and gasped for air, which only enraged her assailant. Why, you little... Austin raised his hand and struck Ashlyn across the face. The crack of the slap made Ashlyn cry out. Lips split. She focused back on Austin as she felt the bruise starting to form, pulsing with every beat of her heart. Austin leaned into the arm bar he had against Ashlyn's neck as he hovered mere inches from her face. I was just going to borrow one or two, but with you gone, I'll manage to snag them all. Don't worry, I'll keep them safe, smiled Austin. Ashlyn's vision was nearly gone when both she and Austin heard something that pulled them from their fight. Hey! Austin's eyes looked up to see Ray standing barely a foot from them, and he looked angry. Before Austin could fully register what was happening, and before Ashlyn had a moment to protest, Ray kneeled and fired something that was on his hip. It was so dark that Austin didn't see the hook launch right at him, and he was too slow to flinch away. All of the borrower boys watched helplessly from under the couch as Ashlyn tried to talk to Austin, and, when all else failed, attack him as she tried to protect the borrowers in her room. They watched in mortified shock as Austin pinned her to the ground and was obviously winning. Ray surrendered his responsibility to talk to the police to Dorian as he charged out from under the sofa, his device on his hips, and aimed it right at Austin. When he pulled the trigger, the device whirred and launched the hook right at Austin's eye. Ray wasn't sure whether it would work, but he had to try. Sure enough, the hook landed right in its mark, making Austin howl in pain and throw himself backward off of Ashlyn. As he writhed on the ground, Ray pulled the trigger again and kneeled as he skidded across the floor right up to Austin's face, his blade ready in his hand. The glinting razor sliced up Austin's cheek as Ray cut his line and skidded to a halt right in front of Austin's face. "That was for my dad, you psychotic lump!" Ray shouted as he turned on a dime and sprinted back toward Ashlyn. Soren was not far behind as he charged out and checked on Ashlyn, his pin at his side. "Ashlyn, are you okay?" Soren called. Ashlyn rolled over onto her side, coughing and doubled over, and managed to nod. "Get away!" she wheezed as she forced herself onto her elbow, protectively hovering over Soren. "Not likely. Snag Ray," Soren instructed as he sprinted forward. It was a shot in the dark, but Soren needed to try this. He needed to keep Austin from running away, and he had an idea to do it. Ashlyn wouldn't have noticed since her focus was on Austin's face, but Soren and his brother saw immediately that Austin was in sock feet, most likely to keep quiet. He dodged one of Austin's swinging legs as he skidded under the other. Soren managed to leap forward in a forward roll before lunging right at his target as Austin's leg swung back. As Austin's foot neared, Soren jabbed as hard as he could and lodged the pin directly into Austin's foot, which earned him another howl of pain. Austin's foot came down to stomp at Soren, which was an immense mistake. Soren dodged, rolling out of the way and sprinting right back toward the couch where he saw Dorian holding Maisie back. Just as Austin's foot connected with the ground, the pin lodged deep in his foot, and Austin cried out again. Ashlyn had just snagged Ray and Soren, ushering them back under the couch, when Austin pushed himself up and pinned Ashlyn again, slamming her front against the ground just as Soren and Ray were out of her grasp. His fingers entwined in her hair as he slammed her face into the ground. "You surrender those little creatures if it's the last..." The front door slammed open with an earth-shattering crash, and police officers poured into Ashlyn's apartment. Dorian, Ray, and Soren, with Maisie clutched tightly in his arms, pulled further under the couch, far away from the edges, as 5 pairs of unfamiliar boots stormed into the room. "Hands up! Hands up! Let me see your hands!" They were saved. Austin's grip on Ashlyn squeezed just a little tighter before he realized he had been beaten. He released his grip on Ashlyn's hair as he was hoisted off of her and slammed into the ground, cuffed, and led out of the room. Ashlyn, dazed, could only hear the roaring panic in her ears as blood pounded against her throbbing skull. Something wet was dripping down her nose, and there was a taste of iron in the back of her throat. Was her nose broken? Or was it from her accidentally biting her tongue? She wasn't sure. What she did know was that she was gently pushed upright by an officer who immediately wrapped her blanket around her shoulders and began checking her vitals. "Ma'am, can you keep your eyes on my finger here? I need to check your pupil dilation," stated the officer. Ashlyn, dazed and feeling a bit muddled, nodded as she did as the officer instructed. Giving a hum of satisfaction, the officer continued speaking. "A 911 call was placed from a nearby apartment saying they heard a disturbance, but the call cut out immediately after officers entered the premises. Do you know who might have made the call? We want to assure them that they did the right thing." Ashlyn shook her head and tried to push herself up a little further against the wall. At this point, another officer stepped up and tapped the young officer on the shoulder. "Well, turns out this is the same guy that had the weird van and all those chemicals.
Our forensics team was combing through to inventory and found a bunch of unauthorized chemicals, he said. Ma'am, it looks like you helped apprehend a bit of a mad scientist. I assume you'll want to press charges. Ashlyn nodded, knowing deep down this would be the only way to keep Austin away and prevent him from hurting anyone else, especially anyone from the borrower community. Hopefully, it would be enough. The two officers exchanged a few more words, but Ashlyn's eyes focused on the base of the couch. She wondered desperately if her family was still safe under there, or if they had managed to get down into the floorboards. She doubted they left, seeing how busy everything was, but it didn't stop her from hoping they were hidden. It was what they said next that brought Ashlyn back to the present. Hey, dude, this guy's a bit out of it. He keeps screaming about how she's hiding little people called borrowers and how they live in the walls. This guy needs some kind of psych eval. I don't think it'll be enough for an insanity defense, but it'll be enough to get him the help he needs, chuckled the officer, as he waved to his friend and headed out of the apartment. Ashlyn's statement neatly written on a clipboard. He said what? Ashlyn muttered as she glanced up at the officer, whose last name was Cormac. He chuckled and shook his head. Who knows? Sighed Cormac as he removed his gloves and scratched the side of his cheek. At any rate, do you have your phone? Asked the officer, as he smiled kindly, seemingly satisfied with Ashlyn's initial physical evaluation. No, it's Ashlyn stopped herself dead. Her muddled mind instinctually went back to the last place her phone was, which was under the couch for Dorian, Ray, and Soren to call the police. Sadly, the words were already in the air, and the officer was already turned around and had looked under the couch. To their horror, Soren, Dorian, and Ray hadn't left their place under the couch. They hadn't managed to get out from under the couch to a more secure location, and it was taking every effort to keep Maisie quiet. They hadn't even thought about tearing open the bottom of the couch to hide up inside of it simply because they had none of their tools with them, and getting close to the edge would get them noticed. It was that combination of errors that led them staying crouched under the couch near Ashlyn's phone when they heard Ashlyn's words and saw, with seemingly lightning speed, the officer spin around, head creating an eclipse of light as two dark brown eyes peered under the sofa. Soren felt every nerve spasm protectively as he threw his arms out and forced his brothers and daughter behind him. There was no doubt from the way Cormac's eyes widened that he spotted Soren and his brothers. Ashlyn was completely frozen. What could she do? Lunge at the officer? Plead with him? Based on the way he lingered, looking under the couch without reaching under to grab her phone, she knew her family had been seen. Soren glanced over his shoulder slightly, noting quickly there were still officers in the hallway that could notice them if they made a run for it now. Cormac's eyes glanced to all of the boys' faces, and then to the phone mere inches from them. Heart pounding wildly, Soren braced himself and opened his mouth to speak, when he spotted the officer's expression change. Officer Cormac smiled subtly, gave an almost imperceptible nod, and pushed himself back upright to crouch in front of Ashlyn. Before Ashlyn could speak or even begin to plead with Cormac, he started to speak as if nothing was amiss. Well, I'm sure you'll be able to find it. If you feel you need to go to the hospital, we can bring you with us in an ambulance, or have you schedule an appointment sooner rather than later, stated Officer Cormac. He fished into his pocket and held out a few cards to Ashlyn. The top one is a physician who will help document the extent of your injuries, who you need to see first thing tomorrow morning. We took some pictures here, but to build your case, you'll need official images. She's really good and will make you feel comfortable. Also, here is my personal number, if you want any updates on the case. Do you have any additional questions? Ashlyn was literally speechless. Had Soren managed to hide? There was no way.
Based on the way he was smiling and that look in his eye, Ashlyn knew Cormac had seen her family. Then, in the quietest of voices, Cormac smiled and whispered, "You have a great family who is very worried about you over there." As he spoke, Cormac nodded slightly toward the couch. Ashlyn felt everything and nothing all at once. That statement alone meant he saw the borrowers and, more importantly, he knew. I know, finished Cormac hurriedly. Ashlyn could see it in his eyes that there was no denying he knew. But before Ashlyn could ask or say anything else, another officer came into the room and Cormac returned his voice to a normal level. "And it's people like us who have to make sure it stays that way. Is there anything else I can do for you, ma'am?" Ashlyn shook her head. No, thank you. I'll be sure to give you all a call, and to get those photos taken. Any good lawyers might be able to help on a budget. I just bought a home," stated Ashlyn. To this, Cormac just smiled and nodded. "Absolutely, and congratulations on your new home. Make sure to let the officers know your change of address, so we can keep an eye out on the place. If this guy makes bail and knows your new home address, we don't want a repeat scenario. Completely up to you, though," stated Cormac. "And Dr. Landry, the doctor who will help take your pictures tomorrow, will have a list of individuals." "Great, thanks," said Ashlyn, making sure to reach out and shake Cormac's hand. She tightened her grip ever so slightly as she made eye contact with him. "Really, thank you." "Our pleasure, miss," he said. Then, as quickly as they came, they went. The officers were out the door with all of the images and evidence they needed. The moment they were gone, the borrower boys sprinted out toward Ashlyn. Soren, even while carrying Maisie, was the first by Ashlyn's side as she stayed propped up against the wall. Instinctually, he crashed into her hand and gripped onto her thumb tightly, keeping Maisie on his other arm. Ray and Dorian were close behind, and their stunned silence was tangible. "Thank you," she breathed, after bringing her hand into her lap and holding her family close. "You all did so well." "That was terrifying," mumbled Dorian. "And what was that whole thing with that guy? He saw us, but didn't say anything. It sounded like he knew. He knew about us borrowers." "He did," agreed Ray. "But him seeing us wasn't nearly as terrifying as Austin grabbing you. Are you all right, Ashlyn?" Ashlyn, eyes closed and head still throbbing a little, nodded slowly. "I'm all right. A bit numb and buzzed, but I'm all right," she groaned. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, and, for the life of her, she suddenly felt exhausted and unable to stay awake. "Are you sure you're all right?" asked Soren as he set down Maisie and gave Ashlyn's thumb a nudge to make sure she was focusing on them. Ashlyn reached up with her free hand and carefully nudged Soren's arm back and rubbed the pad of her index finger along his spine. "I'm sure," she said thoughtfully. Delicately, she fished her thumb and index finger under his arms and pulled him into her palm, scooping him up and bringing him up to kiss his torso. He curled his body to fit the impression of her lips and kissed her back when she pulled away ever so slightly. Ashlyn lowered him back onto the ground near his brothers and his daughter, and, after a few more minutes, she carried them all to the couch where she laid back down. As Ashlyn rearranged her sleeping area, Soren and Dorian went into the next room with the other borrowers to reassure them that everything was fine, and that Austin was no longer going to be a danger to them. It naturally prompted 100 questions, and there was still debate on whether or not they wanted to stay or go. But that would wait for the morning. Everyone was safe, which was the important thing, and the fact Ashlyn had attacked their tormentor in order to protect them was enough to solidify their decisions. They were going with her. Soren and Dorian returned to the main room to find Ashlyn already asleep on the couch. This time, when they laid down, the brothers slept right beside Ashlyn, all of them curling up around or near her head as she laid on her side and dared to close her eyes and sleep again. They were safe once again, and only the small hurdle of moving everyone into their new home was the concern. But that would get to wait for the morning. For now, they slept and reveled in their safety and the joy of their family.